Welcome, everyone. Anyone still standing, please do take a seat. Just waiting for a few more people to take their seats, and then we'll get going. Okay, welcome. Welcome, everyone, to this event, A Systems Approach to Achieving Food Security for All, looking forward from 80 years of FAO. We're delighted that you've joined us. Nice to see a full room of people, as well as plenty of people online. So thank you. It's welcome, and it's great to see you here. I want to start just by reminding you that the event is being recorded and will be made available on the FAO website afterwards. That interpretation is available in Arabic, Chinese, French, Russian, and Spanish. And participants in the room may use their headsets to select their preferred language, while online participants can choose the language channel directly on the platform. My name is Corinna Hawkes. I am Director of the Agrifood Systems and Food Safety Division here in HQ, and I'm very happy to be hosting us this afternoon. Now, our work in the division aims to accelerate agri-food systems transformation by embedding systems-based practices in very concrete ways into policies, programs, projects, and financing at scale. This is cross-cutting work that is fundamental to achieving food security. And we would like to thank our members who have the foresight and to understand the importance of this work. And I'd particularly like to thank the financial contributions of Ireland, Sweden, and Switzerland. Thank you. So in this event, we will be reflecting on FAO's evolution in its thinking and practice of adopting a systems approach and how we can further evolve our approach into the future. For this, I'm delighted to be joined by FAO's Chief Economist, who will be providing opening remarks live from New York. He was called away at the last minute to New York, so he'll be participating live and remotely. That will be followed by a presentation by my colleague, Siobhan Kelly, who will then moderate a panel of FAO colleagues. I will then present FAO's new report on a systems approach, which is available at the back. And then I will moderate a panel with our external guests, Khalid Bomba and Jessica Fanzo, along with the Chief Economist. And that will be followed by opportunity for a small number of questions from the floor. So I would now like to hand over to Maximo Torero, Chief Economist at FAO, for his opening remarks. Over to you, Maximo.
No, thank you very much, Corinna, and thank you all for being with us today. Apologies I couldn't be with you. As Corinna explained, I had to be in New York today. So please, first of all, it's a pleasure to join you today to this important conversation on systems approach to achieving food security for all as we reflect on the 80 years of FAO and look ahead to the future. Over the next 90 minutes, we will explore how system approaches have evolved within FAO and why they are now essential to achieving food security in a rapidly changing world. To do so, it is useful to briefly return to the origins of the organization. First, FAO was born out of crisis. During the Second World War, an estimated 20 million people died as a result of malnutrition and associated diseases. Agricultural productivity collapsed in many regions, agri-food systems were disrupted, and yet the global population continued to grow. When the war ended, hunger was not simply a humanitarian concern, it was a threat to economic recovery, political stability, and peace. It was in this context that FAO was established as the first specialized technical agency of the United Nations, officially founded 8 years before the UN Charter came into force, a powerful signal of the urgency and centrality of food and agriculture to global recovery. On the 16th of October of 1945, representatives of 34 governments signed the FAO Constitution, committing themselves to a shared purpose, to raise levels of nutrition and standards of living, to improve the efficiency of production and distribution of food and agricultural products, to better the condition of rural populations, and to contribute to the expansion of the world economy and ensure humanity's freedom from hunger. All of these are topics that today still are extremely relevant, and that's why the mission of FAO continues to be relevant. 80 years later, food security and nutrition for all remain at the core of FAO mandate, reflecting the same spirit that motivated its founding. Indeed, without resolving hunger and malnutrition, we cannot say that agri-food systems are truly functioning. Historically, efforts to address food insecurity focus primarily on helping farmers to produce more food, particularly staple crops. This production-centered approach was essentially and delivering major gains. And we have seen enormous improvements since the Green Revolution. And if we look at increases in production and productivity over time, we see that there has been a significant improvement, even when we compare to population growth. But over time, it became clear that we need to keep producing more food, but producing more food alone is not enough. We learned that food security depends on multiple interconnected components coming together. Diets that are not only sufficient, but healthy. Food that moves efficiently from farms to markets to people's plates. Viable livelihoods for those who produce, process, transport, and sell food, the whole value chain. The sustainability and sustainable management of land, water and biodiversity, and climate that underpin future production. That sustainability is what will assure us that access to food and access to healthy diets will continue over time. In other words, food security is not delivered by a single sector or intervention. It emerges from the performance of the entire agri-food systems. We also learn often that the hard way that failing to account of these interconnections within the agri-food systems and within the health, environmental, and economic systems comes at a cost. I think the most clear example for us was during COVID-19, where the initial focus was health, but then we realized that there is no health without food, and that was the lemma of FAO to be able to assure that more ports are open and the mobility of food could happen. Food for long and for many years and have not taken into account those externalities and those costs that producing more food will imply. To health systems through poor diets and raising non-communicable diseases. That's the major cost of an inappropriate consumption of diets for human beings, which is related to health and to the health system. So the interconnection with the health ministries is essential. To societies through the inequality and precarious livelihoods, and this is jobs, interconnection with the labor markets, and with the ministries of labor for sure. To the environment through land degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change, an increase in frequency and intensity of climate events. So clearly, all those interlinkages are essential, and there are trade-offs of those that we need to take into account. In this respect, and responding to this need, FAO SOFA of 2023 and 2024 measure these externalities. And it identified that the cost of all of these externalities is $12 trillion, equivalent to nearly 10% of global gross domestic product. Of that total, about 70%, roughly 8 trillion, result from unhealthy dietary patterns that contribute to non-communicable diseases, such as heart diseases, stroke, and diabetes, and to reduce labor productivity. That's why it's so important the emphasis that we are providing to access to healthy diets and to affordable healthy diets so that we can minimize those externalities. These health impacts represent the largest share of hidden costs in more industrialized food systems, of course, and is less in poorer countries. These externalities have in turn undermined the very capacity of agri-food systems to deliver food security today and tomorrow. Responding to these challenges require us to move beyond narrow solutions and adopt a holistic perspective. Converting the true cost of agri-food systems into their true value requires a system approach, one that recognizes interconnections, recognize the importance of intertemporalities, because normally we think a lot of the today, but we don't take into account the tomorrow. And those investments to minimize issues related to sustainability, for example, are intertemporal. So we need to look at that time dimension. Anticipates and manage trade-offs, so we can do things taking into account those potential trade-offs as a result of those interconnections so that we can minimize them in the future. And again, brings the time dimension. And to create co-benefits across the food security, climate mitigation, nutrition, livelihoods, and environmental sustainability. And as a result, resources assures good food for all for today and tomorrow. This evolution has not happened overnight. Over decades, FAO, together with the members and partners, has expanded its analytical lens, its policy tools, and its operational approaches. Across FAO portfolio, we now see interventions explicitly designed to leverage interactions across sectors, strengthen synergies between outcomes, and enhance the capacity of the agri-food systems as a whole to contribute not only to food security, but also to the broader sustainability development goals. This approach is now firmly embedded in FAO Strategic Framework 2022-2031, which calls for a system-oriented transformation across production, nutrition, environment, livelihoods, and inclusive economic development. These principles are captured clearly in the FAO's four betters: better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life, pursued together, leaving no one behind. Each better is interconnected to the other better, so that we can bring the interconnections and we can minimize upfront the potential externalities and accelerate the potential co-benefits and positive effects of working on the different dimensions. Today's event is an opportunity to reflect on how FAO has embraced systems approaches over time, and importantly, how we can continue to strengthen and operationalize them in the years ahead. I really look forward to the discussions that follow and hearing concrete examples of how system approaches are helping us navigate complexity, manage trade-offs, and accelerate progress towards food security for all. Thank you very much, and I wish you a great seminar today. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Chief Economist there, making a very strong case of why a systems approach is central to our mandate at FAO and central to our agenda, and for reminding us in particular that food security is not delivered by any single intervention or sector, and thus requires us to recognize the interconnections. So to illustrate how that understanding has evolved at FAO, I'm now going to turn to my colleague Siobhan Kelly, Agribusiness Officer at ESF, who will make a presentation on that evolution and then moderate a discussion among the panelists. Thank you. Over to you, Siobhan.
Superb. Thank you. Thank you so much, Corinna. And thanks to all of you as well for coming out this afternoon to learn more about systems approaches. So I'll provide a brief overview on the evolution of systems approaches in agriculture and food policy arenas. So I won't be covering 80 years. I have the institutional memory, thankfully. I have the institutional memory of 20 years. Yeah, but I think within those 20 years, they have been particularly indicative and foundational for a systems approach. So following that brief conversation, then I'll have a conversation with Ronnie, Nora, and Vera on how a systems approach is applied from different sectoral entry points. So as a little bit of a background, maybe some caveats to this. So what I'm sharing here really emerges from the development of a publication that's underway, that's due to be published shortly for tools for policymaking on agri-food systems. And part of that, the initial part of that, is to share with policymakers the background and how a systems approach has evolved over the decades. So it's based on a literature review, but it's kind of a rough literature review in a sense. And I wonder if this perspective taken from a different sectoral entry point would be different. So just to share that caveat. But in sharing this with other colleagues, and policymakers as well, it seemed to resonate. So if we look back to the 70s and 80s of farming systems, and this really was an important turning point or shift in perspective from a production-centric approach to the acceptance that the farm was very much interlinked with livelihoods, was very much interlinked with activities in and around the farm gate. And even when I joined in the mid-2000s, the remnants of a farming system approach was still quite prevalent. And I even recall, I still have on my shelf, a publication by colleagues, my supervisors at the time, John Dixon and Doyle Baker, and this seminal publication on food systems and livelihoods. And that really brought us into the development of the livelihoods approach, and a bit further away from the farm gate, from farming as an activity and as the only response to food security and nutrition, and more research around off-farm livelihoods and the interface between household assets, off-farm livelihoods, and food security and nutrition. And then moving on from that, I think that the livelihoods approach really, and the research that went into that, very much emphasized that the reliance on our farm livelihoods was particularly important for food security and nutrition, and the income that was generated from those off-farm livelihoods were important for that diversified nutrition, for instance. So this really laid the ground then, I think, for the value chain approach. I think we're all still familiar and aware of the importance of that approach over the past couple of decades. And that really kind of took us beyond, again, the rural community to the consumer and all of the different actors along the value chain, and the importance that all of those different actors played in the food security and nutrition policy objectives at the national level. So there was very much a heavy emphasis, I would say, particularly initially, on the concept of efficiency and costs. It really was like a business tool at the time. But then over time, and I think thanks to the work of my colleague David Nevin, that really took on more of the concept of sustainability was very much embedded into that approach, and the different dimensions of sustainability became more embedded. Environmental impacts of this approach. And yeah, I think then probably in parallel, but a little bit later, the food security and nutrition approach. I'm not sure if I'm correct in saying that or interpreting that may have been a response to the heavy emphasis on the economics approach of the value chains and the need to really bring us back to the core of food security and nutrition. And in doing so, then that approach developed the very important dimensions of access, of affordability, of sustainability and utilization. And very central to the food security and nutrition approach is multi-stakeholderism, as I would say, and also the environmental aspects of and implications of climate change on food security, and also agri-food production on climate change became more embedded into the agri-food policy discourse. So I believe that with the value chain approach and with the farming systems approach, these concepts really laid the ground, and really you can see, I think, the evolution of a more systemic approach, and this realization that agri-food policy needed to move away from production-centric and rather take into consideration the different subsystems as well that were linked to agri-food. So if I skip maybe to this. So in the latter years, you'll see these range of systemic approaches that have been developed from different sectoral entry points. And again, really emphasizing the realization on the part of the development sector and on the part of countries that a systemic approach is really needed, and that we need to be cutting across different ministerial policy objectives. So I'm sure you're looking down there to see if your approach or area of work is listed. Obviously, this is not exhaustive. This is a selection. We couldn't put everything down there, and really try to, though, show the breadth of systems approaches in FAO and partners' work. And then to the right side here, there's the focus on tools, and this is extremely important, as we all know, because systems can become very abstract. It's very much can be explained at that like cross-sectoral level, the policy level, but when you come down to that more territorial level and creating that red line between what a systems approach means for improved food security and nutrition, improved livelihoods, then that's where the tools and these toolboxes come in. And again, these are just very short selection of the types of toolboxes that are linked to these different approaches. So what are the main takeaways from that? Well, I think, as I said, this move from production as a response to food security and nutrition to the realization that the evidence that policy interventions also need to cater for issues related to nutrition, diverse nutrition, to gender equality, to rural finance, to access to markets, profitable markets, poverty, the poverty dimension as well. And also that within the snake diagram that was showed, the environmental, that was initially in parallel to agri-food policy development, but then at a certain stage they converged. And as we know, the environmental sustainability, biodiversity are now at the core of FAO and government's work in agri-food policy development. Also that sectors into systems. So we've really seen as well this transition from very sectoral nutrition, agribusiness, environment into a convergence of thinking in systems, which Corinna will speak more about. So I think lastly, just to close, the big takeaways from me are that when we do engage with countries, that we see these concepts and we see them reflected back to us in the policies. And for me, that means that they resonate and that they're useful for the countries that we work with. And also that I think we need to acknowledge that there can be fatigue from the donor or from the development community on these different trends that are developed, but I think this shows us that it really is an evolution in thinking and how we support the countries that we support to respond to food security and nutrition. So building on this, I'm going to turn to my panel because, as I said, what really matters here is the operationalization of these approaches. So we're going to have a conversation now that really drills down deep on the operationalization at the country level and what that means. So I'll first introduce Ronnie Braithwaite. So Ronnie, he's a senior agroecology officer with the Plant and Production. Do I need it? No. Yeah. Okay. With the Plant and Production and Protection Division. So Ronnie will be drilling down and speaking to us more about this nexus between agroecology and agri-food systems. And the Deputy Director of Fisheries and Aquaculture Division, Vera Agostini, thanks so much, and Nancy Aberto, the Deputy Director of FAO's Food and Nutrition Division, who will speak to us more about where nutrition or how nutrition sits within the agri-food systems policy domain, and also she'll drill down deeper on the role of food-based dietary guidelines at the national level. Okay, so Okay, so I hope you're all comfortable on our bar stools. Yeah, the idea of the bar stools was to provide kind of less of a barrier between ourselves and the audience, no? To have more of a conversational feel to this session. So thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I know how busy you all are, so yeah, thanks very much for responding to this ask. So maybe I'll kick off then with Ronnie, if that's okay. You're nearest to me. So agroecology. You're going to speak to us about agroecology. So what is it about agroecology that works in terms of its contribution to food security and nutrition and agri-food systems transformation? And maybe in your intervention as well, if you can also refer to, what's working, what lands, no, at national levels and for stakeholders, and then, but what do you see as a big blockage as well? That would be useful. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That is a lot to say in a few minutes. But let's talk about what works for agroecology. When we work on agriculture, we don't just think about crop production and protection, which is the division where we're housed. Farmers work in systems. Farmers manage systems. So they don't have the luxury of compartmentalizing the areas of work. There's no separation of land and water from crop production or land from livestock. So I think for farmers, they really engage with agroecology because it reflects their reality. When we talk about what doesn't work, I think the same principle of compartmentalization doesn't work. When we have to engage with the farmer, we work in crop production in my division. So we then have to speak to them about one area of work, but what happens to the livestock sector? What happens to the land and water management? So we don't have a system where we reflect this systems approach from, and it's not only FAO, also within the ministries of agriculture, you see that they have separated their areas of work, the institutions of education. When we're studying agriculture, we also compartmentalize. So I think we need to readjust how we approach agriculture so that we cater better to farmers who are managing systems. And I speak mainly to smallholder farmers who are the ones that have more diverse production systems.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's super interesting that this systems approach and thinking lands very well with the farmer at the farm level, but it's in connecting those services then to the farm that's where we run into the challenge because of this more sectorial way. So then maybe I'll jump to fisheries, if I may. Vera, and a similar question to you from the ecosystem approach. So this is the systems approach for fisheries that I know you're leading on. So can you kind of respond in a similar setting in terms of what's working and what's not working from that systems approach and the connections between different parts of the system?
Sure. So for an ecosystem approach, you all have to kind of shift your minds and go into the water. If you think about separation, my colleague spoke about separation. Well, in the water, you have no separation. Everything is integrated. So as you heard from the history before, really a lot of that is reflected for fisheries and aquaculture and FAO's work. We really moved away from an extractive production environment decades and decades ago. And over the last 2 decades, we really moved into a systems approach, a holistic approach to how we manage resources in the water. And that's what the ecosystem approach is. So over the past 2 decades, we've done a lot of work to really move this from a conceptual paradigm into an operational objective. And that path has not been easy. We've been deploying a lot of resources to that to help figure out how we do that. The Nansen program funded by Norway, which we celebrated the 50th anniversary this year, is a good example of a really focus on ecosystem systems approaches. Now, you ask what works and what doesn't, or what are some of the challenges. I'm going to list more or less 3 things that work and 3 things that don't work. One thing that's really important is the alignment between governance and social capital. We can have all the policies and legal systems in the world, but we don't have the social capital to help partner to implement, we're not going to go anywhere with the ecosystem approach. The other one is really important, is bridging local, national, regional to even international scales. That's something that's really important, and I'll speak to some of this in the examples maybe later. Also, what works is when you really focus on keeping human well-being at the center. That's essential. Now, what doesn't work is when you have legal and policy work in isolation, and I've already commented on that. Weak monitoring systems are another big challenge. It's really hard to adapt and evolve if you don't have strong monitoring systems in place. Then, one that's I think covers really any work that we do, but lack of financial continuity and political stability is also a big challenge. And also another classic one is lack of sectoral coordination. And of course, each one of those, I could talk about that for a long time, but I won't because I'm going to venture to stay on time. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Vera. So again, I think coming back to what Ronnie was saying about this sectoral coordination, and then adding on to that in terms of challenges, the monitoring and evaluation, I think that also keeps coming up as well in our work. And then the national context, that governments change. So I think that's also another important one, obviously. So Nancy, for nutrition, so I think there we've heard from more kind of sectoral approaches. Nutrition instead plays this much more overarching, because you're looking to inject nutrition into different sectors, infrastructure, agribusiness, health, and so forth. So that's in question then from that more overarching.
Yep. Thanks, Siobhan, and thanks, Corinne and team, for inviting me here today. Yes, I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective. So my colleagues have outlined their perspectives of subsectors within agri-food systems, but nutrition is actually a priority outcome of agri-food systems. And as such, we as FAO have an articulated vision and approach to nutrition that defines our mission in nutrition as addressing all forms of malnutrition through accelerating policy and action across agri-food systems to enable healthy diets for all. Now, what do we know that works to help us achieve this mission? Well, we know that it takes that multi-sectorial, you mentioned this already, Siobhan, multi-sectorial and multi-level action to ensure that we can enable affordable, accessible, available, context-specific, culturally appropriate, healthy diets for all. But we also need to ensure safe food, safe water, and clean environments. And because all of those different pieces are needed for good nutrition, we recognize that we have to take that systems approach for nutrition. But I want to add to your timeline, your historical perspective, because FAO didn't stumble across this systems approach for nutrition automatically. We learned from the work that we've done in the past. Our first nutrition strategy was adopted back in 2012, and we were had a focus on addressing undernutrition. We had a focus on nutrition-sensitive agriculture, but we realized we can't just address one nutritional challenge. 87% of all countries with data show that they have at least 2 forms of malnutrition that reach a threshold of public health importance. We also saw that nutrition-sensitive agriculture wasn't taking into account really important things such as processing, transport, storage, purchase, cooking, consumption, all of these things that go into what it takes to have nutrition outcomes. And so that's what brings us to this systems approach that takes into account all of those different ideas. Similarly, we can't just talk about one sector. Maximo said you can't have health without good food. Well, you can't have good nutrition with just health, where nutrition has traditionally been relegated. We've got to have those resilient, sustainable, healthy healthy agri-food systems. And so we've got to make all of this work. We need those coherent and consistent policies across health, across food, across climate, across biodiversity, trade, et cetera, for nutrition. And that's exactly where the challenge comes, Siobhan, is how do we get all of those sectors to have those consistent policies that are driving us to those healthy diets that we all need and deserve.
Okay, excellent. And your comments also remind me of the role of food safety, obviously for our division, which is foremost. I see our colleagues here, and as they would say, safe food is not food. So, yeah, important to remember that as well. Okay, so kind of grounding us now at the national level, Ronnie, you provided me in our bilateral with a really great example from Argentina, where traditional farming systems, agroecology meet the more modern. No, these are also always the conflicting agendas in multi-stakeholder dialogues on agri-food systems. So can you speak to us more about that example?
Yes, thank you very much. I want to mention something a bit before that example and what doesn't work with agroecology. I think one of the things that we always face, the challenges we face with agroecology, is that it tries to push a change within the system, a type of transformation. And when there are different power struggles within the food sector, and we all know that there are those with power and those without power in our food system. And we have to acknowledge the fact that this needs to change. Some people fight the change because, of course, they're in positions of power, and those who are not in positions of power, usually the smallholder farmer, then has to take what remains in terms of economic or social benefits or lack of benefits. So I think we need to acknowledge the fact that this power play exists, and if we're going to transform food systems, we need to address the issue of inequality or equity and power. Where the agroecology meets industrial production. This is a big fight, yes, because industrial production systems are not necessarily aligned with agroecology. But we have seen that industrial farms are now moving more towards ecosystem-friendly approaches, not because of the need for protecting the environment. I think when we look at the bottom line of having to buy more inputs, more fertilizer, more pesticides because your ecosystem services are destroyed, it then becomes more expensive to grow the same amount of crops or get the same amount of food for year after year. So now they have to invest more in integrated production systems to improve soil health, which again improves their bottom line. So it's more of an economic incentive for large producers to involve more integrated production systems, incorporating the maize production with soybean, with cattle production. I think the acknowledgement that there is a cost benefit there is something new that we're seeing.
Super interesting. And that's in the Pampas, is it? Region of Argentina. Okay. Okay, and then Vera, you were mentioning that even though the ecosystem approach is a new-ish approach, that in Tunisia you found that there's been good results from the application of the approach there. Can you share with us more details on that?
Yes, so I guess as an example, and I will link it to many of the things I talked about in the first intervention, I'm going to raise Tunisia. And this comes from a very small lagoon in Tunisia, which is also a Ramsar site, so an environmentally really important site. It's a site of an important fisheries that is done in a way that is basically really at the heart of the local heritage of the country, the type of fishing that they do. But the fishers started realizing that, fish production was going down. So there you had all the right, you had all the right enabling conditions in place, but also we helped, or the community helped set them up along the way. And what do I mean by that? You had strong governance with a lot of good work happening with the general GFCM, which is a regional fisheries body with a lot of good policy and legal advice for the region. But at the national level, there was some really good policy and legal rules that could be used to do some of the work. At the same time, you also had very strong social capital. The fishers are well organized, they're really interested, they participate. And those two things, governance and social capital, if you remember, I said they need to be aligned. In this place, really, they were aligned and continue to be aligned because of the establishment of a committee that essentially brings together all the different players, both government but also stakeholders, to make decisions and monitor progress in the lagoon. So you also had fairly decent financial stability. FAO has long-standing projects, the MED projects there. There's, like I said, the regional fishery body is active. You also have strong Tunisian Research Institute. So again, it's a connection really of all different players in this place. And through monitoring systems which do work there, they've been able to monitor and adapt as the situation evolved. Now, the really exciting thing is that because of this sort of self-dissemination of all the great work and enthusiasm by the stakeholders, this process for development of a plan and implementation then got sort of captured and implemented in 2 neighboring lagoons. So it started to become a little viral, let's say. Again, with this committee being a really key piece, a place where governance and social capital comes together and there's coordination of the sector and continuous data monitoring, research, and capacity building. So again, really a perfect example of a systems approach that happened at a very local level, will probably extend to the whole Gulf of Gabas, and Tunisia is really excited about this.
Wow, super exciting. Thanks so much, Vera, for that. And Nancy, you mentioned that you're
Yeah, thanks. So I ended my last intervention talking about the big challenge of bringing together all of the stakeholders that are needed to help drive what we want to achieve in good nutrition. And the example of a tool that our nutrition team has put forward to help support this is the food system-based dietary guideline. It is a methodology to build dietary guidelines that not only look at the nutritional aspects of the diet, but also look at the interconnectedness, the opportunities, and the constraints across a food system for achieving those diets. And that allows countries at the national level to build their culturally appropriate healthy diet that can help support good nutrition, but is also helping environmental sustainability and socioeconomic equity. Our team thinks that one of the strengths of this is the process that we're putting forward. So it's not only the outcome, but the process, because it's a multi-stakeholder process of developing these guidelines, because you need all of those different actors that I talked about earlier, from health, from trade, from nutrition, et cetera, from agriculture, obviously, around the table to build these types of comprehensive guidelines. One example of how this can be used to drive not only what it is in terms of nutrition education. You know, you're probably familiar with a food pyramid or a food plate or a pagoda, wherever you may be coming from. You have different visuals of what a healthy diet is for different contexts, but how it drives aligning that policy across different sectors. In Ghana, this is an example, Siobhan, you asked for a very specific one. In Ghana, FAO helps support the development of those food system-based dietary guidelines. And the government has taken that forward to derive action plans across agri-food systems for policies that touch on a whole diversity of sectors, like the health sector, like agriculture, like even the finance sector. So that's a really good example of the country taking the guideline for that educational component, but also for helping that consistency and coherence across different sectorial policy, using those guidelines as sort of a North Star for what it is we want to drive forward for all of those those different parallel outcomes of interest. And the collective process allows for that ownership from different sectors and those outcomes that are relevant for the different sectors. So this can help drive those healthy diets, but then it can also help drive what FAO ultimately wants to achieve, which is that better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Nancy, and thank all the panelists. I think we've really packed a lot in this short conversation. I'm sorry if it felt rushed and that, but some amazing lessons coming out there. The role of multi-stakeholder committees, strong institutions, that convergence between technical and knowledge, evidence plus the process. I think you emphasized the process. So thank you so much to the panelists and to a great conversation. Thank you. So I will pass it over to Karina now and take on a systems approach for agri-food systems.
Evolution. So how do we get it done? We know what a systems approach is. This is a definition here. Maximo and the colleagues that we've just heard from have made it clear that it's about considering interconnections between components and outcomes with all of the benefits that it can bring. And we've just heard from colleagues working in different divisions on different topics, but all of them are thinking systemically, acting and working together systemically. So it applies across numerous topics and entry points. So an important focus has been about how FAO's work has evolved from a production approach from farm to fork. And that was emphasized in the points that Siobhan was making. And getting that relationship working well. And that's implied by the term that was often used, food systems approach. You'll have heard the term food systems approach. But what we've learned from our colleagues is that while the farm to fork relationship is critical, it's not the only one. And it's about looking at the system as a whole and considering all of the different relationships that matter. Not all of those relationships will matter everywhere, but in some places it'll be market linkages. In other places it will be between urban and rural. In other places it will be about linking social capital and environmental capital. In other places it will be about tackling a critically difficult power dynamic. And in every place it will be about the relationships between people. But it's about identifying what relationships really matter and between whom. So that's why we use the term now, systems approach in food and agriculture, because it is related to all of these different relationships that we see. So we have a tremendous opportunity to learn from all of the experience that FAO has built up over the last 80 years, and many other institutions have done so as well. It's an opportunity to bring together the numerous efforts, the significant investments that are underway to improve productivity, on food safety, on nutrition, on health, on economic development, on livelihoods, from production all the way into consumption. So it's a vision. It's a vision of progress. It's a vision that involves us all, whatever part of agri-food systems we work on, adopting a systems approach, adopting these practices. It's not a separate group of people over here working on agri-food systems. We all are. It's up to us to all take a systems approach. And it's not about top-down control of a puppet master moving everything together at once. That would be unworkable and unrealistic. It's up to all of us, whatever our entry point, to adopt this approach. But if we don't have clarity, if we haven't done the work of bringing together the lessons that have been learned and developing a shared and consistent understanding of how to implement a systems approach in practice that anyone can adopt, whatever their sector, whatever their specialism, their mandate, their level, their scale. It will be hard for the system to move forward together, which is what we need for food security and nutrition for all. It will mean that a systems approach will just stay at the level of rhetoric, or it will stay at a scale that is not sufficient enough for it to really accelerate progress towards food security. So, this is the gap that FAO's new publication fills. It provides and brings together and learns the lessons from practice. It brings together this architecture of systems-based practice. It's a normative product, and it defines the practices that, if not embedded in our work, will lead us back to the pool of fragmentation and away from transformation. And the way that we developed this report was to start with practice, to start with the kind of examples that you've heard of, that you were hearing about just a moment ago, and numerous examples that countries are taking as well. So to learn from practical implementation, but also to review the work and then to understand the theory that comes from the research, and in particular from systems science, so that we're basing on practice, but also an understanding from the science of how systems actually work. In other words, they're complex, and changing systems means embracing that complexity. And we found that it was by going to the countries that we could really find inspiration in order to make this a practical and grounded guide. And that going to the countries that have figured it out, that we need to embrace complexity in order to make change, and have found practical ways of doing it. And we feature these examples throughout the report. And from this, it led us to identify the 6 practices of a systems approach. And you've heard them all already, because they just bring together what we already know and what we're already doing. But the unique aspect is the way that they bring them together. Systems thinking, systems knowledge, systems governance, systems doing, systems investment, systems learning takes us all the way from the mindsets that we need to understand and see connections, all the way to implementation and the financial aspects that you need to drive that implementation. Now, what this framework does is to bring together these essential elements of systems-based practice so that it is clear that everyone can see the good practice, and you've just heard some examples of that. So it's consistent, so that the same expectations across policy, across projects, across financing, that it's implementable. All of these activities are feasible and part of everyday practice, that they're adaptable. Everything always needs to be tailored to context and applicable to any subsystem and scale. Replicable, so teams can adapt them, the same practices as standard, and observable and trackable. We've defined the practices we expect to shift, monitor, and learn from. And in each of these 6 practices of a systems approach, we are clear how they differ from a siloed approach. We are not suggesting that people are still in those silos, but it varies across the system. And for each one of those practices, we identify the 3 core shifts that we all need to make in order to adopt a systems approach. I'm not listing them here. They're in the report for you all to read. But they're practical and are put into place through practical actions. And I've listed a few examples on the right-hand side here, each of which comes from a country-based example. So these are the 6 practices of a systems approach that we have learned from practice and embrace the complexity that we know from research is the agri-food system. And we make the case that while implementing all of these practices bring benefits, truly transformational change will happen when they're all practiced together. It's not a theory, but a reality that we are working in a complex system. And if we are to accelerate progress towards food security and nutrition, we must embrace that reality. So just imagine if you're working in a particular community, trying to improve food security for a certain group of people to increase access to healthy and nutritious foods reliably for that particular population. And you know that it's going to take changes in different parts of the system to make that happen, and indeed with interrelated systems. And you come in and you have this idea that this is what needs to happen. You've spoken to the communities and so on. But there's nobody else there who's really able to see the system, who's not really able to be cognizant of the importance of seeing connections. You're not going to get very far if no one is able to think systemically in that room. You need a certain number of people to do that. And then you need the knowledge of in the system. And if you don't have that knowledge, you might end up flying blind in a direction that is not the right direction. You need that knowledge of the dysfunctionalities, you need the knowledge of the vulnerabilities, of the power relations, of the bottlenecks and the blockages in order to move forward. That means you need the governance. And I need say no more, that's been mentioned several times already, to bring the different people of the system together. And you need then to move to the doing, the implementation. You can do all of this, but it's not, if it's not implemented, it's not actually delivered. And if those deliveries, those actions don't take into account trade-offs, don't take into account co-benefits, and don't try and move different parts of the system together, it won't succeed. And of course, for that, you need to have the resources flowing as well in terms of human capacity and financial resources, which we call system investment. That's going to lead to the adoption of different practices, and that will lead to agri-food systems transformation and the different outcomes that we want to see. So this is why we are saying that if we really want to transform food systems, we need to apply all of these 6 practices which embrace systems science and are feasible and doable. So there are 2 realities that we need to embrace. The first is the reality that we're working in a complex system, and if we don't embrace that reality, we will not be able to transform it to accelerate progress on food security and for all, for now and the future. But it's likewise a reality that working at the level of systems is hard, and that focusing on the work of building relationships and interconnections is not the easy path, and we heard some challenges from our colleagues here. So our hope is that providing as a normative reference, that FAO providing as a normative reference, this unifying set of practices which learns is fundamentally rooted in practice, that all can adopt whatever they are doing in agri-food systems, will provide a collective way forward. Thank you.
Before we will move to our second panel discussion, who we will ask what they think it takes to ensure an even wider adoption of a systems approach, we want to ask you that same question. So you will see behind me right now a QR code which will lead you to Mentimeter, or you can go to menti.com and use the code 85272500. And then you will see that question. What is one priority action or change we need to see to accelerate an even wider adoption of a systems approach? Menti will help you to really only pick one action or change, which we all know is not easy because we've just stressed for about 45 minutes that everything is interconnected and interlinked. But if you really do struggle to pick one, I do know that Menti also allows you to make multiple entries. So you can start sharing your thoughts, and we will keep this open for the rest of the session. So if anything comes up in the discussion that you do want to contribute, please do. And we will go back to these thoughts after this panel discussion. And we will keep the code on the next couple of slides. So in case you didn't catch the QR code straight away, the code will still be on. Corinna, that's over to you for the second panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Anouk. Thanks very much. One of the things we haven't mentioned is the deep period of uncertainty that we're currently living with multiple when it comes to food security. with multiple interconnected challenges that the agri-food systems face. But we've heard from colleagues about the importance of leveraging the connections and the opportunity that they have of opening up new pathways, recognizing it's not easy. So we want to focus on the opportunity. And for that, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome some guests today. I'm going to first turn to my guest who is online before turning to my guest here in person, Khaled Bomba. So I'll start with Jessica Fanzo, who unfortunately had an injury over the weekend, which is why she wasn't able to join us in person. But if we could see Jess online, please. Jess, welcome back to Italy. You've just joined and you've just taken up your role as the James Anderson Professor of Food Policy and Climate at Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe, building on your work at Columbia Climate School and your long leadership on nutrition, climate and food systems, including through the HLPE and the Food Systems Dashboard. And through your work, Jess, welcome. Thanks for being here despite your injured foot. Through this work, you know well how closely climate, nutrition and agri-food systems are connected. And looking ahead, what are the main barriers that still prevent these challenges from being addressed together? And where do you see the most promising opportunities for bold actions that build connections between these silos moving forward into the future? Over to you, Jess.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Corinna, for the invitation. And again, I'm sorry I can't be there. You're only 2 hours away, but my injury is preventing me from being mobile. So the interconnections between climate, nutrition, and agri-food systems are critical. I think most people recognize that. But there are real barriers to ensuring that they connect up. So I'll mention 3 barriers and 4 opportunities. And obviously, these are not exhaustive to the barriers and opportunities, but some that I thought about. The first barrier is the rigid institutional structures. So many governments operate within silos where ministries focus on their specific mandates. And if you think about climate, agriculture, health, environment, these are all monolithic, complex sectors in and of themselves with huge mandates. And a lot of times governments are operating in those silos without really recognizing the overlaps. And of course, this hampers integrative approaches of what you had talked about, Corinna. And, for example, the meteorological offices, those that generate a lot of really useful climate information in countries in real time, they're often not communicating or collaborating with frontline health workers or frontline nutrition workers who are dealing with some of the health consequences of extreme events, and vice versa. So we see a lot of this breakdown within countries where the operational needs are quite huge. And this is not really anyone's fault, but it's just sharing knowledge and reaching across the aisle can be really complicated. The second barrier is the lack of comprehensive data. Existing data often highlight individual disciplines rather than interconnections. For example, nutrition data might not incorporate local climate variability impacts on food production or socioeconomic factors. Climate models only go so far. They model a handful of staple crops and not the nutritious foods that many of us care about, including livestock and fish. That was for Vera. And of course, we only really are looking at the impacts of climate on production and diets, but we're missing that whole middle part of the value chain. So there's not enough comprehensive data that integrates and gives a full story of the synergies and trade-offs. And the third barrier I see is stakeholder engagement. Diverse stakeholders, particularly local farmers, local communities, they frequently lack representation in decision-making processes, which can lead to policies that really don't reflect their realities and the trade-offs that they face on a daily basis. So those are just 3 barriers. Where I see potential opportunities, one is integrated national planning. And I know FAO has been very involved in this, as well as ICANN. encouraging companies to, or countries and companies, to incorporate climate, nutrition, and agri-food systems into their national development plans to align efforts to meet food insecurity and climate challenges. Policies can be designed to promote those synergies. For example, agroecological or regenerative practices can enhance soil health while providing nutritious foods. So you can really see these synergies when you start making these plans together. Indonesia is one of the first countries to create a climate and nutrition action plan. So we're starting to see countries do this. A second opportunity is this cross-sectoral, multi-sectoral initiatives. Initiatives like One Health, there is no choice but to integrate and collaborate. So One Health can be expanded to include climate resilience, ensuring ag practices not only promote food production, but has components of health systems, animal systems, and environmental sustainability. Uruguay has been doing some interesting work on this cross-cutting One Health approach that engages these sectors. And my last two opportunities I was thinking of, Corinna, one is digital technologies. We are at the new futures of digital technologies like remote sensing, geospatial analysis, that can facilitate real-time data collection of the climate impacts on food systems and communities. So this is a really key opportunity that we need to understand and how we can ethically use these technologies. And last, community-led solutions. I talked about how a barrier is often that farmers and communities are not at the table, but we need to empower and enable communities to lead and develop local solutions that foster their ability to adapt to a changing climate. So programs that encourage co-creation of adaptation strategies, et cetera. And we've been working a lot with herders in Mongolia and pastoralists in northeastern Kenya, and they've been developing their own solutions of how they can adapt in an incredibly difficult climate. So to ensure that they can eke out a living, a dignified living in these very climate vulnerable geographic poverty traps that many people are living in. So community-led solutions are so key and need to be balanced with those digital technologies and solutions. And I'll end there. Thanks, Corinna.
Thanks so much, Jess. A really, really interesting array of barriers and opportunities here. And I'd now like to turn to Dr. Khalid Bomba, CEO of the Development Sovereignty Group and former founding CEO of the Ethiopian Agricultural Transformation Agency. And you've got extensive experience working alongside governments and others across Africa to drive agricultural transformation through a systems lens. Now, you know that many governments now recognize, at least in principle, that progress on food security and nutrition depends on recognizing the interconnections between agriculture, nature, and economic development. So drawing on your experience of working directly with countries, what are the fundamentals that governments need to put into place to be able to make the decisions that Jess has pointed out and others have pointed out are so hard to take, and implement policies that take these connections into account?
Thank you, Corinna. And first, thank you for inviting me to this important conversation. It's nice to be back at FAO HQ among so many former colleagues and friends. You know, there's one thing that I think we think about and we recognize when we consider systems level change at in a national context. And that's the fact that public sector capacity, governments are critical to getting to scale. There is no way you'll be able to implement any program at scale in any country without the public sector. Of course, private sector is important, development partners are important, but the policy and the public good investments that the public sector has to make in order to work at scale is fundamental. And when we think about the capacity of public sector, I think there's a lot of investment that's been made for decades on individual capacity building and technical support. However, what's missing is institutional capacity. And when we think about institutional capacity, it's almost a 3x3 matrix that for us is important from a systems perspective. So, you know, on the top, if you think about that matrix, it's what kinds of capabilities are important and what do they look like? Where do they sit And then thirdly, how do they function to ensure systems level change? And then in terms of the types of capabilities that you apply those three kind of issues around, the first and most important, like you have here at FAO, is who is actually, systems thinking is something that every part of the government has to do, just like every part of FAO has to think about things from a systems perspective. You know, Ronnie talked about his area of work has to think from a systems perspective, as did Nancy and Siobhan and others. Now, while different parts of the public sector have to think in a systems perspective, you also have your group who is trying to bring all these things together and bring the toolkits and best practices in systems thinking. In the public sector, you don't have that kind of unit in many cases with the types of analytical capabilities that works across government to design programs that break down the silos. So what are the capabilities required to think and function in that way? Usually analytical capabilities that identify the kind of data gaps that was mentioned previously. Where are those data gaps? Who invests in those? How do we make sure that those data sets are shareable across systems? So there's that analytical capability we have to build within public sector. The second is execution. There are far too many strategies and policies that sit on the shelves in many governments, and we spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars developing these, socializing these, but they're not executed. So what does execution capacity actually look like? Government doesn't have to do everything, but in many cases, it drives things to get things done. So we have to build execution capacity throughout the public sector. And then lastly, we all talk about coordination, but we need mechanisms to coordinate. We need mechanisms to hold people accountable. And we need mechanisms to fix problems during the execution phase. We can't just have donor-funded projects that tick off boxes of activities that get done that don't deliver results. We have far too many of those, and we have to course correct during implementation if something might tick off the box as an activity that's been executed, but it doesn't deliver the outcomes and the impacts that we're looking for. So what does that course correction and accountability mechanism actually look like? Which goes far beyond a governance council that sits and kind of talks about we need to coordinate more. After a while, every minister gets tired of that and sends a delegate. And even those delegates kind of, they might get a per diem and participate in that, but it never results in anything. So we have to think about what does that coordination mechanism actually look like, and what does it deliver, and how does it deliver, based on the capabilities, institutional capabilities that need to be embedded within these structures. So let me stop there.
Thanks so much. Fantastic points there. Very well taken about the realities of what it takes to actually deliver this type of approach and what that's going to take. Maximo, I'll turn to you. Now, I think most of us in this room, if not all, fully grasp the value of a systems approach. But we know there are these barriers. We've just heard about some of them. Looking ahead, where do you see the most promising opportunities to build confidence among our members that it's worth investing in systems approaches? Over to you, Maximo.
No, thank you very much, Corina. And look, I think FAO, since the design of its strategic framework, has tried to take this and make this operational. So first, let me start with the creation of your division, where you are director. The ESF division is a food systems division, but also linked to food safety, which is linking to health issues, linking to what is relevant for food related to the safety and the consumption of individuals, which is also related to the IPPC and to we doing Codex Alimentarius. Second, we host the hub of the Food System Summit, which the idea is exactly to bring systems and operationalize these through conveners at the country level. And third, we also host the support mechanism of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, which opens to a bigger dimensionality, not only of hunger, but also the relationship with poverty and how we can act. So we have improved a little bit on the institutionality side. But where I see more opportunities and being very pragmatic on where we can move things forward. First, at the normative and analytical level. I think we are uniquely positioned to translate system thinking into operational useful of global public goods, from data, metrics, and standards to analytical framework that helps countries. For example, we have tools in place that help us to optimize with governments how they can optimize their budgets to minimize the trade-offs that we have been talking about. That's the PolOpt tool that we have developed in the ESA division. We also have designed the true cost accounting methodology, which basically what FAO did is try to create a normative benchmark on how to account for this and how to measure this. And that took us 2 years of 2 SOFAs consecutively, the first time ever. But I think we did a significant progress, and that's something over which we can continue moving. We also are part, together with Jess and Gain and many other partners, the chief statistician in the case of FAO, on the countdown report. So metrics, how we can measure progress of the systems. And the countdown report tried to bring a series of indicators that keep improving methodologically and also in terms of collecting information so that we can track the progress, because it's not just an issue of measuring, but also to track if we are progressing. And that's a tool that the hub will be using, of course, as a metric to see the progress of what has happened in the last 6 years of the operations since the Food System Summit. So at the normative level, I think FAO can have many entry points, and we are doing some of those, but there is more space to keep moving. Just talk about geospatial information. We have developed the geospatial platform, which allow us to bring all the different metrics, and that's a clearly system approach, because we're not looking at productivity only, but also looking at layers of climate, of land degradation, soil, and so on and so forth. So again, that help us. The same with the situation room, that help us to bring 12 risks together and understand the different problems that we could be facing because of the changes in the evolution of those risks, climate and non-climatic risk. Second, the second area where I see significant potential for us to grow is on the policy interface. FAO can add distinctive value by helping countries to move from sector-specific policies to coherent cross-sectoral policy packages. And this, of course, requires what my dear friend was saying, Khalid. We need to bring human capital, we need to bring institutions in place, and FAO is very well positioned to work with the ministries, but that's not enough. One of our accelerators is human capital development, and that's where the human capital development and the institutionality, and given the setup of tools that this institutionality requires, could play a significant role. FAO convening power and technical neutrality allow us to bridge ministries and stakeholders that rarely work together. For example, right now we are linking, of course, our main minister is the Ministry of Agriculture, but we link with environmental ministries, we link with health ministries for nutrition, and we also link with the Ministry of Finance, which sometimes is essential to be able to make a reality of that new institutional design and the development of the human capital that is required. And then having tools in place. The roadmap of SDG 2 and 1.5 degrees is also trying to bring this phasing approach to try to combine multiple goals at the same time. And finally, third, I think at the country level and investment level, FAO's growing operational experience working alongside IFIs, development banks, and national institutions, which started with the investment center, but now is also expanded together with the investment center by the Hand in Hand initiative, which is helping us to design implementation of investment plans to resolve concrete priorities in territorial approaches, but combines not only production, but also sustainability and also access to healthy diets. So elements of nutrition, resilience, and environmental sustainability can bring together and then bring to that innovative finance. So I think we have shown that this can be done. Today we are in 83 countries, and we have raised more than $6 billion of concrete investments in countries that will allow us to make that difference. So I think looking ahead, our major value of FAO is being a system integrator, connecting evidence to policy, policy to investment, and short-term actions along the transformation. So let me stop there, Corina.
Thanks, Maximo, setting out a comprehensive agenda for us moving ahead. Now, Khalid, you've worked at FAO in the past, and so you know the organization. And based on that experience, but also your experience of working right with countries, what do you think FAO could be doing more of or differently to help countries build those institutional capacities that you were talking about earlier?
I think there are two things that FAO brings that are quite unique. One is the technical capabilities that FAO has on the ground are unparalleled. maybe it's the CG system that has that kind of capability in some countries. And the second is the reputation and the credibility it has when it engages with different partners. So given those two unique strengths, I think there's probably three things that FAO can do. First is, in its engagement with different development partners, financial institutions, philanthropies, and donors, is to accentuate the need for investment, increased investment in building institutional capacity within the public sector and investing in a systems approach. Unfortunately, while many of our development partners talk about systems approach, if you look at the funding that actually goes down to countries, very little actually goes to institutional capacity building or a true systems approach. A lot of it tends to be value chain funding or in specific parts of the system rather than strengthening the system as a whole or improving the coordination of the system. So one is in nudging and advising our development partners to put more funding towards it. The second, which might be somewhat difficult for FAO, is in embedding some of its technical capabilities directly within the public sector and supporting the public sector in building that institutional capacity in a learning by doing execution mode. Instead of designing projects with the public sector and then having these projects supported by FAO, have FAO staff who have those technical capabilities and a willingness work hand in hand inside ministries, inside the public sector, in supporting that capacity building. And the third and finally, as Maximo mentioned, the hand-in-hand initiative and the investment center here are truly unique in the way that they engage the private sector and brings the private sector investment towards an engagement in advising or refining policy to incentivize more investment. I think there's more comfort at the HQ level in engaging with the private sector than you probably have on the ground in the country offices. So I think there's probably more confidence that I would suggest that HQ give to your country offices to engage private sector. I sense sometimes when I engage with the country offices of FAO in African countries, there's still a reticence of, is this really what we want, what we're intended to do? There's more comfort in engaging public sector and in designing programs than actively engaging private sector. So I think that's another place and a final place that I might suggest put more emphasis on that at the country level. That's where a lot of the financing will come from in the future.
Thanks very much. Good advice for us there at FAO. Now I want to turn to Jess again. You're, as an academic professor, deeply involved in generating evidence. You've mentioned some of that a moment ago. How do you think FAO should continue to ensure that evidence of this interconnectedness in agri-food systems? You mentioned data earlier, but how can we work better so it's more effectively translated, the evidence is more translated into policymaking and implementation on the ground? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. I mean, it's hard for me to say what FAO should do because I am not in the house and I don't know how the sausage is made, so to speak. But I have to say, FAO's been quite revolutionary over the last several years, and I think I owe a lot of that probably to Maximo and colleagues of really bringing up the data systems of FAO and really becoming an incredible leader in that space. So to me, data is so key. And I think as you were alluding to, Corinna, we have this kind of issue of death by data. We have a ton of data. It's just how do we use it more effectively for policymakers? And, maybe I'll just argue for 3 or 4 things, but I do want to emphasize that we are at an incredible, unique time right now in that facts, data, and evidence are under incredible scrutiny, even openly disregarded as suspect by some political leaders. And to me, this is a really, really difficult time to be arguing for better data and evidence, but it's also the most important time to be arguing for better data and evidence for policymakers, because data can bring wholesale changes to political thought and action. So I want to preface that with, we should not be naive of the time that we are in. To me, we need really three things, and I would love to see FAO work more in this space. One is on data integration platforms. So really integrating those diverse data sets, and FAO has a lot. And it sounds like, Maximo, that's already happening around what's happening in agriculture productivity, climate impacts, and nutrition outcomes, allowing for policymakers to visualize those connections through data so they can really understand the synergies and trade-offs. We're at a time now where we have a lot of data. We just need to integrate it better in a very comprehensive, understandable way for policymakers so they can look at the entire landscape. The other is performance, and Maximo had mentioned the food systems countdown. Not only should we be tracking how food systems are progressing and the trends across food systems, but how are they actually performing? How far are they off from the SDG targets? Where are the places where countries are struggling? So really setting out targets and benchmarks for food systems is going to be key. And the countdown, not to plug, but the countdown will have a paper on that in the next few months out. Also, data-driven needs assessments, ensuring that we collect data in specific contexts to uncover the localized challenges that communities face across their food systems. We often collect the top-line data, the national data. We need much more localized subnational data, and that's not easy to collect. And we need more of this place-based research where communities are participating in long-term assessments of their situation. And then maybe last, Corinna, is, again, data, but capacity of policymakers needs to be enhanced. We need more data literacy. And again, those who are generating data and evidence, we need to translate that data in very digestible, easy to understand ways for policymakers, because they just don't have time to look across a whole suite of databases and figure out which filters they need to be using to understand their context. So we, as the researchers, need to be really thinking about innovative tools to bring data to people who don't have time to really take the analysis to a deep level. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess. And I'd like to ask you to give a round of applause to our panelists. I am going to come back to them. I'll come back to Jess, Maximo, and you, Khalid, for the last word. And I'm conscious that time is moving on fairly rapidly. But I hope that some of you may be able to stay a little bit longer than the scheduled end in a couple of minutes, just so we can have a couple of questions and to surface some of the thinking that you're having as you're watching us today. But this last session was very much about what we need to do to move forward into the future. And I did spot my colleague from the Office of Youth and Women sitting here. And of course, if we don't have youth, we don't have anything going forward into the future. So if a couple of you would like to be thinking of questions, and I think the Mentimeter is also going to go up behind us as well. If I can pass to you, if I can, for a minute, and then if there's a couple of questions from the floor, that would also be excellent. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Corinna. And yeah, so for those that don't know me, my name is Oisin Gill, and I'm leading the education program within the Office of Youth and Women. And I'd just like to highlight throughout all of this, and thank you very much for all of your contributions and discussions today, but the importance of youth engagement, and it's one of the things that I put on in the Mentimeter. And what we really want to do when we're creating some of these futures, and harking back to the International Day of Education, this year the theme is the power of youth to co-create education. But I would also like to extend that to agri-food systems. So we need to encourage youth to be involved in these spaces, to support them to engage in these spaces. And that's one of the most important things, is really supporting their engagement. And through one of the programs that we work on together with our colleagues in ESF and the Agri-Food Leadership Education Program, intentionally designing those educational programs to connect young people with the expertise that exists here in FAO across all the different domains. So going back to what you said, Ronnie, as well, education institutions sometimes compartmentalize some of the programs that we're doing. We have an opportunity here to not compartmentalize it, but to give young people access to the wide diversity of expertise that exists here, looking at the systems thinking that we're talking about, then also giving them support to be able to develop educational advocacy interventions, looking at the systems doing approach as well, and supporting them to be able to implement that on the ground. And looking at just one quick example of how this works, and one of the graduates that we had from the Agri-Food Leadership Education Program last year was a young woman in Uganda, and she designed this program, or an advocacy project, that would look at creating a repository of indigenous food crops in her local community. And what started out as just sort of a research repository of these indigenous food crops really went to something that engaged local artists to be able to share their stories, create art projects on these indigenous food crops. She engaged with local cooks and traditional leaders in her community to be able to share cooking methods with these food crops. And then she created a capacity development program that was able to share this as well. And so she created this repository and then shared that with local community stakeholders as well. So really bringing all of this different systems approach to be able to do one small thing that can advocate and encourage other young people to get involved in this approach. And thank you very much for your continued support on this, Corinne and the ESF colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you. We must build the capabilities of governments and we must build the capacities of youth as well as learning from youth. So can I ask if there are a couple of questions from the floor? Okay. There's one at the back here. If you could just introduce yourself and be very, very brief, please. Thank you.
Hi, I am Ajit Karna, and I work in Animal Health Division, and very much in One Health. And that's very much related to what our speakers were saying about the interconnectedness. And I'm also a health system practitioner. So when I'm thinking about when the systems work, is to try out during for example, of pandemics or disease outbreaks, when systems often tend to fail. But my question to you, sir, when we differentiate system support, system strengthening support, and then when we're thinking about system resilience support, how do you differentiate those three areas in the interventions that you're planning or designing? When you're saying that we need to have that group of people, or when we're sitting in the ministry supporting them, how do you make them differentiate, but at the same time think about the systems? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that question. And it really kind of comes down to fundamentally what have we done in the design of our programs? Because let me give you an example of the Ethiopia program, which I spent 10 years working on and helping to design and implement. This was a program that ultimately reported to the Prime Minister. And for him, and like most national leaders, they think in 3 to 5 year chunks. They're not thinking 15, 20 years in most cases. In some cases they are, which is fantastic. And it allows you to then design a systems approach that is truly holistic. But in many cases, they're literally thinking till the next election cycle. So in the work that we did with the Ministry of Agriculture and with many of the other ministries is think about what are the near-term outputs that the Prime Minister needs immediately in the next year to 3 years. What can we do that builds momentum? At the same time, what are the structural changes that we need to address so that these solutions are sustainable, both financially, socially, and environmentally? And then longer term, what are the things that we need to put in place that ultimately transforms the sector from a subsistence-based sector to one that is much more market-oriented and commercial? So we were solving for 3 things simultaneously, but the thing that most policymakers were looking at was the 1 to 3 year horizon. But we had the institutional capacity to look much further, to engage partners in helping us design for all 3 segments. And that's why, I talk about institutional capacities being so important. Otherwise, you're literally only designing for that first piece. That first 1 to 3 year horizon without thinking across systems, without thinking long term. If you have a technical capacity that is mandated to think across these 3 dimensions, then you can do all 3 simultaneously. Although, like we talked about, Corinna, in our one-on-one, we had to start with the immediate. Without that, you don't build credibility, and you can't work on the others.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to have to wrap up now. So I'm going to give the last word to the panelists and ask a final question. And I'm going to start with Maximo, if you're still there. That in one sentence, what is the single shift that would most accelerate the uptake of systems approaches for food security over the next decade? Maximo, just one sentence, please.
Very easy question. But I think tangible results will be the most important things. What I keep asking you is about these blueprints, how we can identify the blueprints that work and show results. And that's what will bring confidence of our members. That's what will bring confidence of countries, because we will be able to show that systems approach has a business case. And as Khalid and Jesse has mentioned, I think that business case is there, but we need to show that it works at different levels in the short term, medium, and long term, so that we can move forward.
Thank you, Maximo. Jess.
So, Corinna, asking someone to say something in one sentence about a systems approach is a bit ironic. I would say, building on Maximo as a step-by-step, revolutionizing funding mechanisms to prioritize holistic outcome-based investments that particularly reward integrated food system practices that are working. But you need Maximos to be able to do this one.
Step by step. No, that's a great answer. Thanks. Last word to you, Khalid.
I would say analytical capacity within the public sector that sits outside the line ministries, that's able to look across, work across, and design programs that bring everybody together, reporting to, ultimately, the highest levels of government to ensure coordination across public, private, and civil society.
Wonderful. Thank you for those last words, and thanks to the panelists, and thanks for you for being here and for participating in the Mentimeter, which we're looking at later. Have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you, and let's have a round of applause. Thank you.